The blood-stained letter trembled in Phoebe Miller's hands as she stood on the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, beating down on her shoulders in the summer of 1883. The words swam before her tear-filled eyes. Custody revoked, moral turpitude, unfit mother. She clutched her 4-year-old daughter Emma's hand tighter, knowing that by sundown tomorrow, the child would be taken from her and placed with a family the county deemed suitable. "Mama!" Emma's voice was small, confused. Her golden curls caught the sunlight as she looked up. "Why are you crying?" Phoebe quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart, just the dust." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. One mistake falling for the sweet lies of a married man passing through town, and Judge Hammond had decided she was unworthy of her own child. "Mrs. Miller." The stern voice behind her made her spine stiffen. Sheriff Taylor approached, hat in hand, his expression grim but not unkind. "I'm sorry about the judge's ruling. I truly am." "You know this isn't right, Sheriff." Phoebe's voice cracked. "I've never done anything to harm Emma. I work honest hours at the boarding house. I've never, I know." The sheriff sighed, glancing at the courthouse behind them. "But Judge Hammond has traditional views, and the Pattersons are an influential family in these parts." The Pattersons, her former employer until Mrs. Patterson discovered the affair with her traveling cousin. The same family who had orchestrated this entire charade of justice to punish her. 24 hours, Mrs. Miller," the sheriff continued quietly. "I'll be by tomorrow at this time to, well, you know." As the sheriff walked away, Phoebe sank down onto the courthouse steps, pulling Emma into her lap. The little girl nestled against her, innocent and unaware that their world was crumbling. Phoebe breathed in the scent of her daughter's hair, memorizing every detail, the small weight of her, the warmth, the perfect trust. How could she possibly say goodbye? "Excuse me, madam." Phoebe looked up, squinting against the sun to make out the figure of a man standing before her. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the dust of the trail still clinging to his clothes and boots. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could see a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of beard. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, voice deep and measured. "Seems like you've got yourself in a tight spot." Phoebe instinctively held Emma closer. "It's not your concern, Mr. Name's Dawson Forrester." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and eyes that held both weariness and something else, determination. "And I think it might be my concern after all." He crouched down to be at eye level with her. "I've seen injustice before, madam. And I'm not fond of standing by while it happens. Unless you can change a judge's mind overnight, there's nothing to be done," Phoebe said bitterly. Dawson's gaze shifted to Emma, who was studying him with curious eyes. He offered her a gentle smile before looking back at Phoebe. "There might be another way," he said quietly. "What if there was suddenly a father in the picture?" Phoebe stared at him, uncomprehending at first, then with dawning understanding. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious, madam." His eyes never wavered from hers. "A marriage certificate, and a man willing to claim that child as his own might give that judge pause." "You're a stranger," Phoebe whispered, though something about his steady gaze made her feel as if she'd known him longer. "To you, yes, but not to these parts. I grew up in Willow Creek, left for the war, and came back to work cattle. Been away on a long drive to Colorado, but I've got land just outside town, respectable enough at least." He looked at Emma again. "What's your name, little one?" "Emma," the child answered, no longer shy. "Do you have horses?" A smile creased his weathered face. "Several, including a gentle mare that might be just right for a young lady to learn on." Phoebe felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Dawson's expression grew serious again. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, and I know what it's like to lose family." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Think about it. I'll be at Maggie's diner until sundown if you decide you want to talk more." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Phoebe staring after him, her mind racing between hope and suspicion. The courthouse clock struck 4 times. 20 hours left until they would come for Emma. "Who was that man, Mama?" Emma asked. Phoebe stroked her daughter's cheek. "I'm not sure, sweetheart, but he might be." She hesitated, the word both absurd and strangely compelling. "A friend." The walk back to their small rented room above the laundry was slow, each step heavy with the weight of Phoebe's impossible choice. Trust a stranger or lose her child forever. What kind of choice was that? Mrs. Chen, the laundry owner, greeted them with her usual warm smile, but it faded when she saw Phoebe's face. "Bad news at court?" she asked, her accented voice gentle. Phoebe nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You good mother, Mrs. Chen said firmly, patting Emma's head. "Judge wrong." "Thank you," Phoebe managed, "but being right doesn't always matter in this world." "What you do now?" Phoebe glanced down at Emma, who was already distracted by the shop cat. "I don't know yet, but I need to figure it out quickly." She led Emma upstairs to their tiny room with its single bed and the small trunk containing all their worldly possessions. Not much to show for 26 years of life, but it had been enough. They had each other. While Emma played with her rag doll, Phoebe paced the room, thinking of Dawson Forrester's offer. Marriage to a stranger, it was madness. Yet people entered arranged marriages all the time, and this would be temporary, surely. Just long enough to convince the judge that Emma had a stable home with 2 parents. But what did she really know about this man? He claimed to own land, to be from Willow Creek originally. Those things could be verified, but his character, his intentions. He could be worse than the judge's solution. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their small room, Phoebe made her decision. She would at least speak with him again, ask more questions. She had nothing to lose by gathering information. "Emma, put on your shoes," she said, smoothing her own dress. "We're going to get some supper." "At Maggie's?" Emma asked brightly. They rarely ate at the diner, saving every penny Phoebe earned. "Yes, at Maggie's." The diner was busy with the evening crowd when they arrived, mostly ranch hands and miners enjoying a hot meal before heading to the saloons. Phoebe spotted Dawson immediately, sitting alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood as they approached. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet strength she'd noticed earlier. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm not sure why I did," Phoebe replied honestly, "but I need to know more about what you're proposing." He gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Please join me. Have you eaten?" When she hesitated, he added, "My treat, of course." Once they were seated and had ordered Emma, delighted by the promise of apple pie for dessert, Phoebe studied Dawson more carefully. In the lamplight of the diner, she could see that his face, while weathered from outdoor work, was younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps 30 or so, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than not, though he wasn't smiling much now. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked directly. The truth this time. Dawson's hands, large and calloused, wrapped around his coffee cup. "The truth is complicated. I have nowhere else to be tonight," he nodded slowly. "I told you I grew up here. My father was the blacksmith until he died 10 years back. My mother passed when I was young." He paused. "What I didn't mention was that I had a sister, younger than me. She got in trouble, similar situation to yours, I'd guess. Only difference was, I was away fighting when it happened. By the time I got back, her child had been taken and placed with a family in Tucson. She He swallowed hard. She took her own life 3 days later. Phoebe's breath caught. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, he said, though the pain in his eyes suggested otherwise. But when I saw you today, heard what that judge was planning. He shook his head. I couldn't walk by, not again. So this is about your sister, partly, he admitted, but it's also about what's right. That child belongs with her mother. He glanced at Emma, who was carefully arranging the salt and pepper shakers. And I meant what I said about having land. It's a small ranch, but it's mine free and clear. I've been saving to build a proper house. Right now there's just a cabin, but it's solid. Room enough. And what would you expect? From me? Phoebe asked, the question difficult to voice. His eyes snapped back to hers, understanding her meaning instantly. Nothing improper, Mrs. Miller. This would be a marriage on paper only to satisfy the law. You and Emma would have your own space. I spend most days with the cattle anyway. Their food arrived, interrupting the conversation. Phoebe watched as Dawson helped cut Emma's meat into smaller pieces without being asked, his hands gentle despite their size. Emma chatted to him easily, asking about his horses and if he had any cows that gave milk. He answered each question seriously, as if speaking to an adult. How would this work? Phoebe asked when Emma was occupied with her meal. Practically speaking, we get married first thing tomorrow. Reverend Walsh opens the church at dawn. He's known me since I was a boy. He'll do it without questions. Dawson leaned in, lowering his voice. Then we go directly to the judge. I'll claim to have been away working, just returned to find out about Emma. Say we've been corresponding about marriage for months. And you think he'll believe that? What matters is whether he can disprove it, and he can't. Dawson's expression hardened slightly. Hammond's a stickler for the letter of the law. If I'm your husband and claim that child is mine, he'll have no grounds to take her. Phoebe tried to imagine it, being married to this man, living in his cabin, creating a false life together. It seemed impossible. Yet the alternative. What if he asks Emma? She worried. She's honest to a fault. We'll explain to her that it's a game. Children understand games. He hesitated. Mrs. Miller, Phoebe, she corrected. If we're considering this madness, you should at least use my given name. Phoebe, he said, the name sounding different in his deep voice. I know this isn't ideal. I know you have every reason to be suspicious of my motives. But I give you my word as a man that I will respect you and protect Emma. And when enough time has passed that the judge's interest has moved elsewhere, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. The offer hung in the air between them, impossible yet increasingly inevitable. Outside, the sun had set completely, the darkness a reminder that the hours were ticking away. I need to think, Phoebe said finally, and speak with Emma. Dawson nodded. Of course. I'll be at the church at dawn if you decide to come. He placed money on the table for their meal. Whatever you choose, I wish you both well. He stood, touched the brim of his hat in a small salute to Emma, and walked out of the diner, leaving Phoebe with the most important decision of her life. The walk back to their room was silent, Emma sleepy and content after her special meal. As Phoebe helped her prepare for bed, she tried to find the words to explain what might happen tomorrow. Emma, sweetheart, she began as she brushed the child's hair. You remember the man we had supper with? Mr. Forrester, Emma nodded. He said I could ride his horse someday. Yes, he did. Phoebe took a deep breath. How would you feel about us going to live at his ranch with his horses? Emma's eyes widened. Really, could we? It's possible, but it would mean some changes. Mr. Forrester would. Well, he would be like a father to you. Emma considered this seriously. I don't have a father. Everyone has a father, sweetheart. Yours just isn't here. It was the explanation Phoebe had always given, vague enough to satisfy a young child. The truth that Emma's father had been passing through town, and had neglected to mention his wife waiting back east would come later, when she was old enough to understand. Would Mr. Forrester be a good father? Emma asked. The question struck Phoebe's heart. I think he might be, she said softly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. There had been kindness in his eyes when he looked at Emma, genuine interest in her childish chatter. But it would mean pretending sometimes, pretending that we've known him longer than we have. Like a game of make-believe. Exactly like that. Do you think you could do that? For me, Emma nodded solemnly. I'm good at make-believe. Phoebe hugged her tightly. Yes, you are. Later, with Emma asleep beside her in their narrow bed, Phoebe stared at the ceiling, weighing her options one final time. Marriage to a stranger was frightening, full of unknowns. But losing Emma was unthinkable. And something about Dawson Forrester had inspired trust despite her best instincts. Perhaps it was the story about his sister, or the gentle way he'd interacted with Emma. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no other choice. As the town clock struck midnight, Phoebe made her decision. She would meet Dawson at the church. She would become Mrs. Forrester, at least on paper. And she would do whatever it took to keep her daughter. Dawn broke pale and clear over Willow Creek. Phoebe had barely slept, but she'd used the quiet hours to pack their few belongings and write a note to Mrs. Chen explaining their sudden departure. Now, holding Emma's hand, she stood before the small white church at the edge of town. Dawson was waiting on the steps, dressed in clean clothes, his hat in his hands. His face showed signs of a recent shave and his hair was neatly combed. When he saw them approaching, relief washed over his features. You came, he said simply. We did, Phoebe replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Emma broke away to run up the steps to him. Mama says we're going to live with your horses. A smile cracked his serious expression. That's right, little one, if that's what you both want. Emma, remember what we talked about, Phoebe prompted gently. Emma nodded, her face suddenly serious with the importance of her role. I'm supposed to say you're my pa now. For the game. Dawson crouched down to her level. That's right. But only when other people ask. When it's just us, you can call me Dawson. He glanced up at Phoebe. Unless your ma prefers something else. That's fine, Phoebe said quickly, though the ease with which Emma had accepted the situation made her throat tight with emotion. The church door opened and Reverend Walsh appeared, his kind old face curious. Dawson, you mentioned an urgent matter. Yes, Reverend. Dawson stood, gesturing to Phoebe and Emma. This is Phoebe Miller and her daughter Emma. We've come to be married. The Reverend's bushy white eyebrows rose, but to his credit he asked no questions. I see. Well then, you'd better come inside. The ceremony was brief and surreal. Standing before the altar with morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, Phoebe repeated vows she never thought she'd say, to a man she'd met only yesterday. Dawson's hands were warm and steady as he placed a simple gold band on her finger where he'd gotten it at such short notice. She didn't know and couldn't ask. By the power vested in me, the Reverend concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He smiled at Dawson. You may kiss your bride. A moment of awkwardness passed between them. Then Dawson leaned forward and placed the lightest of kisses on her cheek, his breath warm against her skin. Thank you, Reverend, Dawson said, shaking the older man's hand firmly. We appreciate your discretion in this matter. Of course, my boy. The Reverend's eyes twinkled as he looked between them. Love often moves in mysterious ways. Outside, the sun had fully risen, painting the town in golden light. Phoebe felt disoriented, the weight of the ring on her finger alien and strange. We should go to the judge now, Dawson said quietly. Before the sheriff comes looking for you. The walk to Judge Hammond's house on the hill above town was tense. Phoebe felt as if everyone they passed could see the deception written on her face, but the few early risers merely nodded in greeting or looked curiously at the unusual grouping. The judge's housekeeper answered their knock, surprised to find visitors so early. "The judge is at breakfast," she said doubtfully. "Tell him Dawson Forrester is here with urgent business regarding yesterday's custody ruling," Dawson said, his tone brooking no argument. They were shown into a formal sitting room to wait. Emma, sensing the tension, stayed unusually quiet, holding tight to Phoebe's hand. After several minutes, Judge Hammond entered, still dabbing his mouth with a napkin, his expression irritated. "Forrester," he said gruffly. "What's the meaning of this intrusion? And why is Mrs. Miller here? She knows my decision is final." "That's Mrs. Forrester now, Judge," Dawson said, his voice cool but respectful. "We were married this morning by Reverend Walsh." The judge stared, first at Dawson, then at Phoebe, his eyes narrowing. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke, sir. I've just returned from a cattle drive to find that my intended had gotten herself into some legal trouble in my absence." Dawson placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "And that my daughter was at risk of being taken from her mother." "Your daughter?" The judge's voice dripped with skepticism. "Yes, sir, mine." The certainty in Dawson's voice was absolute. Mrs. Miller made no mention of a father during the hearing. "Phoebe was protecting me," Dawson said smoothly. "I asked her to keep my name out of it until I returned and could make things right." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Our marriage certificate, signed this morning. And I've brought the deed to my ranch as well, to show that I can provide a stable home." The judge snatched the papers, examining them with a scowl. "This is highly irregular." "Perhaps, sir, but it changes the circumstances considerably, doesn't it? Emma now has two parents in a legal marriage, with a home and means of support." Dawson's tone remained respectful but firm. "There's no longer any cause to separate her from her mother." Judge Hammond turned his cold gaze to Emma. "Child, do you know this man?" Before Phoebe could panic, Emma nodded seriously. "That's my pa. He has horses." The simplicity and certainty of her answer seemed to take the judge aback. He looked between the three of them, his frown deepening. "I don't like being made a fool of," he said finally. "No one's trying to do that, sir," Dawson replied. "I'm simply trying to keep my family together as any man would." A tense silence filled the room. Phoebe hardly dared breathe. Then the judge tossed the papers onto a nearby table with a noise of disgust. "Fine. The custody order is rescinded, given the change in circumstances." He pointed a bony finger at Dawson. "But I'll be watching, Forrester. One hint that this isn't on the level, you'll find everything in order, Judge. You have my word." Outside, with the sun now high in the sky, Phoebe felt lightheaded with relief. "I can't believe that worked," she whispered. "Hammond's a bully, but he's not stupid," Dawson said, leading them toward the livery stable. "He knows he has no legal ground to stand on now." He looked down at Emma, who was skipping alongside them. "You did perfectly, little one." "Can we see the horses now?" Emma asked eagerly. "We sure can. I've got a wagon waiting to take us home." The word hung in the air, loaded with meaning. "That is, if you're still certain about this." Phoebe looked at him in the bright morning light, this stranger who was now her husband, who had just saved her daughter from being taken away. There were 1,000 uncertainties ahead, 1,000 ways this arrangement could become complicated. But for now, there was only gratitude. "I'm certain," she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. The wagon ride to Dawson's ranch took nearly an hour, winding out of town and into the rolling grasslands dotted with oak and mesquite. Emma, excited by the adventure, peppered Dawson with questions about everything they passed. He answered each one patiently, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife she might have missed. Phoebe sat quietly, absorbing the reality of her new situation. Mrs. Forrester, wife to a cowboy, resident of a ranch she'd never seen. It still felt like a dream or perhaps a particularly vivid dime novel. "There it is," Dawson said finally, pointing ahead to where a small cabin stood in the shadow of a rocky outcropping. A barn and corral were visible nearby, and a creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwood trees. "It's not much to look at yet, but the land's good." It was modest, certainly, but to Phoebe's eyes it looked like paradise after the cramped room above the laundry. "It's lovely," she said honestly. As they drew closer, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a lean, mottled hound that barked excitedly at their approach. "That's Scout," Dawson told Emma, who was watching the dog with wide-eyed delight. "He's a good boy, but he gets mighty excited about visitors." "Does he bite?" Emma asked. "Only his dinner," Dawson assured her. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and helped them down. Scout circled them, tail wagging furiously, occasionally jumping up in his enthusiasm until Dawson firmly ordered him down. "He'll settle once he gets used to you," Dawson said as he unloaded their trunk from the wagon. "Hasn't been around women or children much." "Neither have you, I'd guess," Phoebe said with sudden insight. A faint flush colored his tanned cheeks. "That obvious, huh? Just an observation." She took Emma's hand. "Shall we see our new home?" The cabin was simple but clean, with 2 rooms separated by a partial wall. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs and basic cooking implements. A few books lined a rough-hewn shelf. The smaller room held a bed covered with a patchwork quilt, a chest for clothing, and not much else. "I'll sleep out in the barn until I can add on another room," Dawson said, setting their trunk down. "Or build a proper house, which is what I'd been planning anyway." "You don't have to," Phoebe began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "I meant what I said about respecting you, Mrs. Phoebe." He glanced at Emma, who was already making friends with Scout by the fireplace. "This arrangement is unusual enough without adding impropriety." Phoebe nodded, oddly touched by his insistence on maintaining boundaries. It confirmed her initial impression of his character. Whatever his motives for helping them, they weren't dishonorable. "I should show you the rest of the place," Dawson continued. "Then I need to check on the cattle. They're grazing in the north section right now." Outside, he showed them the barn where 3 horses watched curiously from their stalls, the chicken coop with half a dozen laying hens, and the small garden plot where vegetables were beginning to grow. "I'm not much of a gardener," he admitted. "But the soil's good if you've a mind to expand it." "I'd like that," Phoebe said. "I used to help my father with his garden when I was young." Emma had already discovered the smallest of the horses, a dappled mare that nuzzled her hand gently through the stall door. "That's Penny," Dawson told her. "The one I mentioned might suit you for riding lessons. If your mother agrees, of course," he added quickly, glancing at Phoebe. "Can I, Mama?" Emma's face was alight with hope. "We'll see," Phoebe said, not wanting to make promises in this strange new situation. "Mr. Dawson may be busy with his work." "I always find time for important things," Dawson said, his eyes meeting Phoebe's with quiet sincerity. "And making sure Emma feels at home here is important." The simple statement, and the consideration behind it, made something shift in Phoebe's chest. This man was a stranger still, yet he was thinking of her child's happiness as a priority. After the tour, Dawson saddled his horse, a tall chestnut gelding. "I won't be gone long," he promised. "There's food in the pantry and the pump by the garden has good water." Phoebe nodded, suddenly uncertain now that they were to be left alone in this unfamiliar place. "We'll be fine," she assured him, more confidently than she felt. As he rode away, Emma waved enthusiastically, Scout at her side. "I like our new house, Mama," she declared. "And I like Mr. Dawson, too." "Do you?" Phoebe asked, curious about her daughter's impressions. Emma nodded seriously. "He talks to me like I'm big, and he has nice eyes. Sad sometimes, but nice." Out of the mouths of babes, Phoebe thought. She had noticed the same thing about Dawson's eyes, an underlying sorrow that surfaced occasionally, particularly when he spoke of his sister. "Well, let's make ourselves useful while he's gone," she said, pushing aside her reflections. "We should unpack and perhaps prepare a proper meal for when he returns." The rest of the day passed in a blur of domestic activity. Phoebe found the cabin well stocked with basic supplies, suggesting Dawson had prepared for their arrival or lived more comfortably than the sparse furnishings might indicate. She baked bread in the small cast-iron stove, hung their few clothes in the chest, and swept the plank floors until they gleamed. Emma spent the afternoon alternating between helping her mother and playing with Scout in the yard, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the unfamiliar surroundings. By the time Dawson returned, dusty and tired from his work, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and the stew Phoebe had prepared. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed space. "You've been busy," he observed, removing his hat. "Least we could do," Phoebe replied. "Supper's nearly ready, if you'd like to wash up." A strange expression crossed his face, something like wonder mixed with uncertainty. "Thank you," he said finally. "It's been a while since anyone cooked for me." The meal was quiet but not uncomfortable. Dawson complimented the food several times, and Emma chattered about her adventures with Scout and her plans to learn to ride Penny. After helping clean up, Dawson excused himself to sleep in the barn, despite Phoebe's protestations that she and Emma could take that space instead. "This is your home now," he said firmly. "I'm used to rougher accommodations than a barn with fresh hay." Later, lying beside Emma in the bed that smelled faintly of soap and the outdoors, Phoebe stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she had been facing the loss of her daughter. Now she was married, living on a ranch and sharing her life with a man she barely knew. It should have felt wrong, or at least frightening. Yet something about Dawson Forrester's quiet strength and evident decency made it feel possible. Not easy, certainly, but possible. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, Phoebe's last thoughts were of his promise. When enough time had passed, if she wanted to leave, he wouldn't stop her. It was a comfort, knowing there was an exit from this arrangement. Yet a small, surprising part of her wondered if she would want to take it when the time came. The next weeks passed in a rhythm of gradual adjustment. Each day, Phoebe learned more about running a ranch household, managing the chicken coop, tending the expanded garden, preparing meals that would sustain a working man. Emma blossomed in the open spaces, following Dawson like a shadow whenever he was home, absorbing his patient lessons about horses and cattle. For his part, Dawson kept his word about maintaining distance. He continued sleeping in the barn, though Phoebe had helped him make the space more comfortable with extra blankets and a proper pillow. He was unfailingly polite, even a bit formal with Phoebe, though she noticed he relaxed more when interacting with Emma. They developed an unspoken routine. Mornings began with breakfast together, before Dawson rode out to check the cattle. He would return for the midday meal if he wasn't working too far afield, and always came home by supper time, where they would eat together and sometimes sit on the porch afterward, watching the sunset while Emma played with Scout. It was during these quiet evening moments that Phoebe began to truly know the man she had married. Dawson spoke sparingly about himself, but when prompted, he shared stories of his childhood in Willow Creek, his time serving in the war, and his dreams for the ranch. "I want to build a proper house," he told her one evening, 2 weeks after their hasty wedding. "Over there by those trees. 2 stories with glass windows and maybe even one of those newfangled indoor pumps." "That sounds lovely," Phoebe said sincerely. "Have you drawn up plans?" He looked embarrassed. "Started to, but I'm not much for drawing, better with my hands than with paper." "I could help," she offered. "My father was a carpenter before he fell ill. I used to assist him with his drafting." Surprise and interest lit his eyes. "I didn't know that." "There's a lot we don't know about each other," she pointed out gently. He nodded, accepting the truth of this. "Tell me more about your father." So she did, sharing memories of her childhood in Ohio, her father's gentle instruction in woodworking and mathematics, her mother's passion for books that had been passed down to Phoebe. She told him about their deaths, her mother from influenza when Phoebe was 16, her father from a lingering illness 2 years later. "How did you end up in Arizona territory?" Dawson asked. Phoebe hesitated. They hadn't spoken about the circumstances that had led to the judge's ruling, the affair that had resulted in Emma's birth, the scandal that had followed. "You don't have to tell me," Dawson said, seeing her discomfort. "No, I should." Phoebe took a deep breath. "After my father died, I had few options in our town. I took a position as a teacher's assistant, but the pay was barely enough to live on. When an opportunity came to travel west with a family seeking a warmer climate for their ailing son, I took it." She paused, gathering courage for the harder part of the story. "We stopped in Willow Creek because the boy had taken a turn for the worse. While the family was consulting with the doctor, I met a man, Thomas Blackwell. He was charming, educated, passing through on business." Her mouth twisted at the memory. "Or so he said. I later discovered the business was visiting his cousin and her husband, the Pattersons." Understanding dawned on Dawson's face. "The same Pattersons who pushed for the judge to take Emma," Phoebe nodded. "After I realized I was expecting, the family I'd been traveling with dismissed me, of course. I wrote to Thomas at the address he'd given me. The letter came back marked return to sender, no such person. It was only later I learned he was married with 3 children back east." Dawson's expression darkened. "He abandoned you. He didn't even know about Emma," Phoebe said softly. "And perhaps that's for the best. I found work at the boarding house, saved enough to rent our room. We were managing well enough until Mrs. Patterson saw me in town with Emma a few months ago. The resemblance to her cousin must have been strong enough for her to make the connection." She sighed. "She made it her mission to see me punished, spread rumors about my character, had me dismissed from the boarding house. Then she and her husband petitioned the court about Emma's welfare." They sat in silence as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, Dawson spoke. "My sister's situation was different but similar enough. The man who left her with child was a cavalry officer passing through. He promised to send for her when he reached his next posting." His voice hardened. "She waited months for a letter that never came. By then, it was too late to hide her condition." "I'm sorry," Phoebe said simply. "I've often wondered if I could have prevented what happened if I'd been here instead of off fighting." He shook his head. "But that's a path that leads nowhere good." "Is that why you helped us? To make amends somehow?" Dawson considered the question seriously. "Partly," he admitted. "But also because it was the right thing to do, and because—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Because," Phoebe prompted. "Because I saw something in your eyes on those courthouse steps, something that reminded me it's a lonely thing living out here by myself." He stood abruptly. "It's getting dark. We should head in." The conversation shifted something between them, an acknowledgement of their separate pasts and the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Over the following days, Phoebe found Dawson more willing to speak, to share his thoughts and even occasionally his worries about the ranch, the cattle, the future. A month after their wedding, he completed work on an addition to the cabin, a small but comfortable room where he could sleep, finally moving out of the barn. Though they were still essentially living as friendly strangers under one roof, the arrangement began to feel less like a temporary solution and more like a real household. It was around this time that Sheriff Taylor rode out to the ranch, ostensibly to check on their situation on behalf of the judge. Phoebe's heart raced at the sight of him approaching, remembering their last interaction on the courthouse steps. "Mrs. Forrester," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Judge Hammond asked me to see how things are faring out here." "We're doing very well, Sheriff," Phoebe replied, inviting him to sit on the porch while she poured him a glass of lemonade. Emma and Dawson returned from the barn, where they'd been tending to Penny. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of them, noting the easy way Emma ran to Dawson, the natural manner in which he scooped her up. "Sheriff," Dawson nodded in greeting. "What brings you out this way?" "Just checking in," Taylor replied, his gaze shifting between them. "The judge still has his doubts about the timing of your arrangement." "Tell the judge we appreciate his concern," Dawson said evenly, setting Emma down. "But as he can see, everyone's thriving here." The sheriff's expression softened as he watched Emma chatter to Scout. "Seems that way," he agreed. "Girl looks happy." He turned to Phoebe. "Happier than I've seen her in town, if I'm being honest." "She loves it here," Phoebe said, and realized with some surprise that she was beginning to feel the same way. The openness of the land, the rhythm of ranch life, the quiet evenings, it suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. After the sheriff departed, seeming satisfied with what he'd seen, Dawson's shoulders relaxed visibly. "I think we passed that test," he said with a small smile. "For now," Phoebe agreed, "though I suspect the judge will be watching us for some time." "Let him watch," Dawson said firmly. "We've nothing to hide." The words hung between them, both true and not quite true. They weren't hiding anything from the judge, but there was still so much unspoken between them, the nature of their relationship, how long it would continue, what exactly they were building together. As summer faded into autumn, these questions remained largely unaddressed. Phoebe found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She enjoyed the physical work, the open air, the satisfaction of seeing the garden flourish under her care. She helped Dawson draft plans for the new house, spending evenings at the table with him, heads bent over paper as they discussed room arrangements and window placements. These planning sessions brought them physically closer than they had been before, shoulders occasionally brushing as they worked. Phoebe became increasingly aware of him as a man, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, the strength in his hands as they moved across the paper, the way his voice deepened when he was thinking deeply about something. For his part, Dawson remained respectful to a fault, never presuming, never pushing. But sometimes she would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unguarded and full of something that made her heart beat faster. Emma, meanwhile, had fully embraced ranch life and her unusual family situation. She had taken to calling Dawson Pa, even when no one else was around, a development that had initially alarmed Phoebe. "You don't need to call him that when we're alone," she had told Emma gently. "Remember, it was just but he is my Pa now," Emma had responded with a child's simple logic. "He teaches me to ride and tells me stories and chases the monsters away when I have bad dreams." This last part was news to Phoebe. "When do you have bad dreams?" "Sometimes. When you're sleeping." Emma had shrugged. "I go to Pa's room and he sits with me until I'm not scared anymore. He says it's a father's job to chase away monsters." The revelation had brought tears to Phoebe's eyes. Dawson had never mentioned these nighttime comfortings, had simply taken on the role of father in ways large and small, without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. As October brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of winter, Dawson began preparations for the cattle drive that would take him away for nearly 2 weeks. The herd needed to be moved to lower pastures, and there were supplies to be purchased in a larger town to the south. "Will you be all right here?" he asked Phoebe the night before his departure. "I've asked Tom Wilkins from the neighboring ranch to check on you every couple of days. He's a good man, married with children of his own." "We'll be fine," Phoebe assured him, though the prospect of his absence left her with an unexpected hollow feeling. "We managed on our own before, remember?" Dawson nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "There's plenty of firewood stacked by the door and the smokehouse is full." "If anything happens, nothing will happen," Phoebe said firmly. "Go do what needs doing. We'll be here when you return." The morning of his departure was gray and chilly. Emma clung to him before he mounted his horse, extracting a promise that he would bring her a surprise from the town. Phoebe stood more formally to the side, unsure of the proper farewell in their unusual situation. "Take care of yourself," she said finally. Dawson hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice pitched low so Emma wouldn't hear. "I've been thinking, Phoebe. When I get back, perhaps we should discuss the future, what you want, whether you'd like to stay, permanently, I mean." Her heart skipped. I mean I've grown accustomed to having you and Emma here, more than accustomed." His eyes held hers steadily. "But this was meant to be your choice, always has been. So think about it while I'm gone, about what you want." Before she could respond, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, squeezed once and turned away. Minutes later, he was riding away with 2 ranch hands who would accompany him on the drive, leaving Phoebe staring after him with a mind full of questions. The first week of Dawson's absence passed uneventfully. Phoebe kept busy with household tasks, and Emma helped care for the chickens and the garden. Tom Wilkins stopped by twice as promised, bringing his wife Martha the second time. The woman was friendly and practical, offering Phoebe advice about preparing for the winter months ahead. "First winter on a ranch can be challenging," Martha said as they shared coffee at the table. "But Dawson's got this place well set up. Better than most bachelors, I must say." "He's very capable," Phoebe agreed. Martha studied her with shrewd eyes. "He's a good man. Been through a lot, from what my Tom says. Keeps to himself mostly, until you came along." Phoebe felt herself blushing under the woman's direct gaze. It was an unusual situation. "Most marriages are, one way or another," Martha said with a laugh. "But I've never seen Dawson look at anyone the way he looks at you, like you're water in the desert." The observation stayed with Phoebe long after the Wilkins had departed. Was it true? Did Dawson look at her that way? And more importantly, what did she feel for him? She had been grateful, certainly. Respectful of his kindness toward Emma, increasingly comfortable in his company. But there was something else growing too, something that made her anticipate his return with a fluttering in her stomach that had nothing to do with gratitude. The weather turned on the 10th day of Dawson's absence. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a bitter wind and the first real cold of the season. By nightfall, rain was beating against the cabin windows, and Phoebe built up the fire higher than usual, worried about the dropping temperature. "Is Pa going to be all right in the rain?" Emma asked as Phoebe tucked her into bed. "He's very experienced at being outdoors," Phoebe reassured her. "And he has shelter with the other ranch hands." But as the night wore on and the storm intensified, Phoebe found herself worrying too. She sat by the fire, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the wind howl around the cabin eaves. Scout, who had taken to sleeping at the foot of Emma's bed, suddenly raised his head and gave a low whine. Moments later, Phoebe heard it too, the sound of hooves approaching, barely audible over the storm. Her heart leaped. Dawson wasn't due back for at least 2 more days. Had he pushed ahead to beat the weather, she hurried to the door, lifting the latch just as a figure appeared on the porch, hunched against the driving rain. But it wasn't Dawson. The man who stood there was a stranger, tall, bearded, with hard eyes that raked over her in a way that made her instinctively step back. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Mighty poor night to be out. I seen your light and was hoping for a bit of shelter." Phoebe hesitated, one hand still on the door, ready to close it. Hospitality was expected in these parts, particularly in bad weather. But something about the man's demeanor set her nerves on edge. "My husband will be back any minute," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He just went to check on the stock." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the single horse visible through the rain. "That's so. Well, I won't impose long, just till the worst of this passes." Before she could object further, he stepped forward, forcing her to move aside or be pushed. Scout growled from the bedroom doorway, hackles raised. "Call off your dog, madam," the stranger said, his hand moving to his hip where a pistol was holstered. "Scout, down," Phoebe commanded, though her instincts screamed at her to let the dog attack. "Sir, I must ask you to state your business clearly." The man moved further into the cabin, water dripping from his slicker onto the clean floor. "Told you, just seeking shelter." He glanced around, taking in the modest but comfortable space. "Nice place. Your husband must be doing well for himself." "Well enough," Phoebe said cautiously. "The storm shouldn't last long. Perhaps you'd prefer to wait in the barn. There's clean hay and it's dry, and miss the pleasure of your company. That wouldn't be gentlemanly." He removed his hat, revealing matted hair beneath. "You got any coffee? Or something stronger?" Phoebe moved toward the stove, keeping as much distance between them as possible. "I can make coffee." As she worked, she kept a watchful eye on the man who had seated himself at the table, mud from his boots soiling the floor. Scout remained at the bedroom doorway, a silent guardian preventing the stranger from approaching that part of the cabin. "You alone out here often?" the man asked as she set a cup of coffee before him. "Never," Phoebe replied firmly. "As I said, my husband will return shortly." The man's lip curled in what might have been a smile. "Thing is, I've been watching this place for 2 days. Ain't seen no husband, just you and a little girl." He sipped the coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "And word in town is that Forrester's off on a cattle drive. Won't be back for days yet." Phoebe felt cold fear wash through her. This was no chance encounter. The man had been watching them, waiting for an opportunity. "What do you want?" she asked, no longer bothering with pretense. "Well now, that depends." He set down the cup. "Could be I'm just looking for valuables. Could be I'm looking for company." His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Or could be I'm working for someone with an interest in that little girl of yours." The last possibility hit Phoebe like a physical blow. "The Pattersons," she whispered. The stranger shrugged. "Didn't say that, but folks with money can be mighty persuasive when they want something, like a child they believe belongs in a proper family." "Get out," Phoebe said, her voice shaking with fury. "Get out of our home right now." The man's expression hardened. "Don't think you're in a position to be giving orders, madam." He stood, pushing back from the table. "Now, here's how this is going to work. You're going to wake that child nice and quiet. We're going to take a little ride. My employers just want to talk to you. Explain how things could be easier for everyone if you were reasonable." "I will never let you take my daughter," Phoebe said, backing toward the fireplace where the poker stood. "Never." The man sighed as if disappointed. Hard way it is, then. His hand moved to his gun. In that moment, Scout launched himself across the room, a blur of fangs and fury. The stranger cursed, trying to draw his weapon as the dog's teeth sank into his arm. There was a struggle, a sharp yelp as Scout was kicked hard, and then the sickening sound of a gunshot. Scout fell, whimpering, a dark stain spreading across his flank. The man turned toward Phoebe, breathing hard, blood dripping from the bite on his arm. "Damn dog," he spat. "Now look what you made me do." Phoebe had the poker in her hand now, holding it like a weapon. "Emma, stay in the bedroom," she shouted, hearing her daughter's frightened cry at the gunshot. The man advanced on her, his expression ugly. "Drop it," he ordered, gesturing with the gun. "Drop it or the next bullet goes in you." Time seemed to slow. Phoebe saw the determination in the stranger's eyes, heard Emma sobbing in the bedroom, felt the weight of the poker in her hand. If she surrendered, he would take Emma. If she fought, she might die and leave Emma defenseless. Before she could decide, the cabin door burst open with a crash of splintering wood. Dawson stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and mud-splattered, his face a mask of cold rage. In his hands was a rifle pointed unerringly at the intruder. "Step away from my wife," he said, his voice deadly quiet. The stranger froze, then slowly turned, keeping his gun half raised. "This ain't your business, Forrester. You're in my home, threatening my family. That makes it my business." Dawson's eyes flicked briefly to Scout's still form, then back to the intruder. "Drop the gun. Now." For a tense moment, it seemed the man might try his luck. Then, seeing something in Dawson's eyes that convinced him otherwise, he carefully set his pistol on the table. "Smart choice," Dawson said, stepping into the cabin but keeping the rifle trained on the man. "Phoebe, are you hurt?" "Emma." "We're all right," Phoebe managed, though her voice shook. "But Scout, Tom's outside, he'll help." Dawson's focus never wavered from the intruder. "Who sent you?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just looking for shelter from the storm, with a gun drawn on my wife." Dawson's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Try again." Before the standoff could escalate further, Tom Wilkins appeared in the doorway, his own rifle ready. "Everything all right, Dawson?" Martha thought she heard. He stopped, taking in the scene. "I'll get the rope," he said grimly. Within minutes, the intruder was bound securely to a chair, his protests ignored. Tom examined Scout, whose breathing was labored but steady. "Bullet went through clean," he reported. "He's lost blood, but he's a tough old dog, should make it with proper care." Emma had emerged from the bedroom, tear-stained but brave, going immediately to Scout's side to stroke his head gently. "You saved us," she whispered to the dog. Dawson, after ensuring the intruder was secured, finally turned to Phoebe. His eyes raked over her, searching for injury and finding none. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "I thought," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "When I saw his horse outside, I feared the worst." Phoebe clung to him, the poker forgotten on the floor, her entire body trembling with delayed shock. "How did you know? You weren't due back for days." "Got worried about the storm, sent the hands on with the herd and rode ahead." His arms tightened around her. "Thank God I did." Over his shoulder, Phoebe saw Tom tactfully busying himself with Scout, and Emma watching them with wide, curious eyes. This was the first time Dawson had embraced her, the first real physical contact beyond the occasional brush of hands or shoulders. It felt right. It felt like coming home in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin around them. Later, after the sheriff had been summoned and the intruder who eventually admitted to being hired by the Pattersons was taken away, after Scout had been carefully tended and Emma had finally fallen asleep, Phoebe and Dawson sat at the table, a lamp burning low between them. "You asked me to think about what I want," Phoebe said quietly, "while you were gone." Dawson looked up from his coffee, his expression guarded. "And did you think about it?" "I did." She took a deep breath. "I want to stay, Dawson, not just for Emma's safety or because it makes practical sense, but because I've come to care for you more than I expected to. More than makes sense, perhaps, given how we came together." The guardedness in his eyes gave way to something warm and hopeful. "I've felt the same," he admitted. "From almost the beginning, if I'm being honest. But I didn't want you to feel obligated or pressured, not when you came to this arrangement out of necessity." "It may have begun that way," Phoebe said, reaching across the table to place her hand over his. "But it's become something else, something real." Dawson turned his hand to clasp hers, his grip firm and warm. "I want to build a life with you, Phoebe, a real marriage, a family with Emma, if that's what you want too." "It is," she said simply. "It's what I want." He stood, still holding her hand, and gently pulled her to her feet. When she was standing before him, he reached up to cup her face, his touch reverent. "May I kiss you?" he asked, so formally it almost made her smile despite the seriousness of the moment. "Properly this time, not like at the church." "Yes," Phoebe whispered, already leaning toward him. "Please." His lips met hers with gentle certainty, a promise and a beginning all at once. Phoebe's arms wound around his neck as she returned the kiss, feeling something bloom in her chest, something that felt remarkably like happiness. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he murmured. "When I saw you on those courthouse steps, I just wanted to help. I never imagined you would become so essential to me." "Life has strange turns," Phoebe replied, thinking of all the decisions and circumstances that had led them here. "But I'm grateful for this one." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and a sky full of stars. Inside the small cabin, something new had been born, a family formed not by blood or legal documents, but by choice and growing love. Winter settled over the ranch with a blanket of snow and quiet days spent largely indoors. The cabin, which had seemed spacious enough in warmer months, grew intimate with 3 people, and a recovering dog sharing the confined space. Dawson had moved a cot into the main room rather than return to the barn, a temporary solution until spring when construction on the new house could begin. For Phoebe, these close quarters brought a new dimension to their evolving relationship. There were small, domestic moments that filled her with unexpected joy, watching Dawson teach Emma to play checkers by the fire, the 3 of them reading together from one of his small collection of books, his hand finding hers in quiet moments when Emma was occupied elsewhere. They were taking things slowly, still learning each other, still careful with this fragile new thing between them. Their kisses grew more frequent, more comfortable, but Dawson maintained his respectful distance otherwise, never presuming more than Phoebe offered. December brought preparations for Christmas, a holiday Phoebe had celebrated minimally in previous years, having little money for luxuries. But Dawson insisted they mark the occasion properly. "Emma deserves a real Christmas," he said one evening as they sat at the table, Emma already asleep. "And so do you." "We don't need elaborate gifts," Phoebe protested. "Just being safe, being together, that's enough." "Maybe so," Dawson agreed, reaching across to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a casual intimacy that still made her heart skip. "But I want to see you both smile on Christmas morning. Will you let me have that?" How could she refuse him when he looked at her that way? So Phoebe found herself drawn into his enthusiasm, helping cut pine boughs to decorate the cabin, baking special treats with their carefully rationed sugar, and even sewing a new shirt for him in secret while he was out with the cattle. 2 days before Christmas, they made the journey into town for supplies and the few gifts Dawson insisted on purchasing. It was their first visit to Willow Creek since the incident with the intruder, and Phoebe felt nervous as they approached the main street in the wagon. "What if we see the Pattersons?" she asked quietly, Emma asleep against her side, bundled in blankets against the cold. "Or the judge?" "Then we hold our heads high," Dawson replied, his jaw set. "The Pattersons' hired man confessed everything. They've lost standing in the community because of it. And the judge knows better than to interfere with us now." His confidence bolstered her, and indeed, their reception in town was warmer than Phoebe had expected. News of the attempted abduction had spread, casting the Forresters as victims of a wealthy family's vindictiveness rather than participants in a suspicious marriage. Several people greeted them kindly, and Mrs. Chen from the laundry embraced Phoebe with tears in her eyes, delighted to see her and Emma thriving. As they completed their shopping, Phoebe noticed Dawson speaking quietly with the proprietor of the general store, who nodded and disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper which Dawson quickly tucked inside his coat. "A surprise?" Phoebe asked with raised eyebrows. Dawson's eyes twinkled. "Can't tell you. It would ruin Christmas morning." Their last stop was the sheriff's office, where Dawson wanted to check on the status of the case against the Pattersons. Sheriff Taylor greeted them cordially, offering coffee to ward off the winter chill. "The Pattersons left town," he informed them as they sat in his small office, Emma exploring the wanted posters on the wall with wide-eyed fascination. "Packed up and headed back east after their man was sentenced. Seems they couldn't face the gossip." "Good riddance," Dawson said firmly. "And the judge?" Phoebe asked. "Is he still concerned about our situation?" Sheriff Taylor's weathered face creased in a smile. "Judge Hammond is many things, Mrs. Forrester, but he's not stupid. He knows when he's been outmaneuvered." He glanced between them, his expression softening. "Besides, anyone with eyes can see you're a proper family now. No pretending about it." The observation warmed Phoebe as they drove home through the snowy landscape. A proper family. Not one formed in the traditional way, perhaps, but real nonetheless. Emma had grown to adore Dawson, and he had become the father she'd never had, patient and kind and steadfastly present. And as for Phoebe and Dawson, she looked at him as he guided the horses, his profile strong against the winter sky. What had begun as gratitude and cautious respect had deepened into something she could now admit freely to herself: love. She loved this quiet, honorable man who had stepped into their lives when they needed him most, who had asked for nothing in return except the chance to care for them. Whether he felt the same depth of feeling, she couldn't be certain. He cared for her, yes, desired her, increasingly obviously. But love? He had never spoken the word, and neither had she. Perhaps it was still too soon. Christmas Eve brought a clear, cold night with stars scattered like diamonds across the sky. After a simple but special supper, they sat before the fire, Emma nestled between them on the small sofa Dawson had acquired from the Wilkins place when they purchased new furniture. "Can we open just one present tonight?" Emma pleaded, eyeing the small collection of packages arranged on the table. "Please, Pa," Dawson pretended to consider this serious request. "Well, I don't know. What does your mother think?" "One small one," Phoebe conceded with a smile. "But the rest must wait for morning." Emma selected a package wrapped in newspaper and tied with string, a gift from the Wilkins children, who had become her occasional playmates. Inside was a wooden top, painted in bright colors, which Emma immediately wanted to try on the plank floor. As she played, Dawson shifted closer to Phoebe on the sofa, his arm draping casually along the back behind her shoulders. "I have something for you," he said, his voice low enough that Emma wouldn't hear. "Something I'd rather give you privately." Phoebe looked at him with surprise. "Tonight?" He nodded. "After Emma's asleep, if that's all right." The quiet request sent a shiver of anticipation through her. What could he want to give her that required privacy? She nodded her agreement, trying to focus on Emma's delight with her new toy rather than the warmth of Dawson's body beside hers or the promise in his eyes. Later, with Emma tucked into bed and drifting to sleep with dreams of Christmas morning, Phoebe joined Dawson by the fire. He stood as she approached, a small package in his hands. "It's not much," he said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "But I wanted you to have it, before tomorrow's excitement." Phoebe accepted the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside a small box was a pendant on a delicate silver chain, a heart-shaped locket, simple but beautifully crafted. "Open it," Dawson urged softly. Inside the locket were two tiny photographs, one of Emma, laughing, and one of Dawson himself, looking serious but with a warmth in his eyes that the camera had somehow captured. "How did you manage this?" Phoebe asked, touched beyond words. Photographs were expensive and rarely available in small towns like Willow Creek. "There was a traveling photographer in Boulder City when I was there with the cattle," Dawson explained. "I had him take mine, and Mrs. Wilkins had one of Emma from when the same fellow came through last year. She let me borrow it to be copied." He hesitated. "I thought, well, that you might like having us both close to your heart, since we both hold you in ours." The simple statement, so heartfelt, brought tears to Phoebe's eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Will you help me put it on?" Dawson took the necklace and moved behind her. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp, lingering perhaps longer than necessary. When Phoebe turned to face him, his expression was serious, his eyes dark with emotion. "Phoebe," he began, taking her hands in his. "These past months, they've meant everything to me. You and Emma have brought life back to this place and to me." He took a deep breath. "I know our beginning was unusual, that you agreed to marry me out of necessity, but I need you to know that he paused, seeming to struggle for words. Phoebe squeezed his hands encouragingly. "Tell me," she said softly. "I love you," he said finally, the words rushing out as if he'd held them back too long. "I love Emma as if she were my own flesh and blood, and I love you in a way I never expected to love anyone. I don't want this to be a marriage just on paper anymore. I want it to be real in every way." Phoebe felt her heart swell with joy. "It is real," she said, stepping closer to him. "It has been for some time now, and I love you too, Dawson, so much." The kiss that followed was different from their previous ones, deeper, with a current of longing that had been carefully restrained until now. Dawson's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as if he couldn't bear any space between them. Phoebe wound her fingers into his hair, giving herself over to the feelings she'd been gradually acknowledging for weeks. When they finally parted, both breathless, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to be my wife," he murmured. "In every sense, but only when you're ready." Phoebe smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I think I've been ready for some time now." The look of wonder and desire that crossed his face made her feel beautiful, cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. With a glance to ensure Emma was truly asleep, Dawson took Phoebe's hand and led her toward his room, the small addition that would soon be replaced by the grand house they had planned together, but which tonight would become the place where their marriage truly began. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, the sun reflecting off the snow with dazzling brilliance. Phoebe woke in Dawson's arms, momentarily disoriented before remembering the events of the night before. She blushed, recalling the tenderness and passion they had shared, the whispered words of love, the feeling of finally being truly, completely his wife. Dawson stirred, his eyes opening to find hers already watching him. A slow smile spread across his face, and he reached up to touch her cheek. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Forrester," he murmured, pulling her closer for a kiss. "Merry Christmas, husband," she replied, the word no longer feeling like part of a charade. They might have remained there longer, savoring the newfound intimacy between them, had Emma not come bursting into the room with all the excitement of a child on Christmas morning. "Pa, Mama, Santa came," she exclaimed, scrambling onto the bed with them. If she noticed anything unusual about finding her mother in Dawson's room, she gave no indication, too focused on the promise of presents waiting. Phoebe exchanged an amused glance with Dawson, who winked at her over Emma's head. "We'll be right there, darlin'," he promised. "Just give us a minute to get ourselves together." The day unfolded in a haze of happiness. Emma was delighted with her gifts: a new doll with a porcelain face, a picture book about horses, and most exciting of all, a child-sized saddle that Dawson promised to put on Penny when the weather improved. Dawson seemed equally pleased with the shirt Phoebe had made him, and the book of poetry Emma had helped select, with considerable guidance, from the general store. But his greatest reaction was to the gift Phoebe had kept hidden until last: a framed drawing she had made of the house they planned to build, rendered with the skill her father had taught her years ago. "This is incredible," he said, studying the detailed sketch. "It looks exactly how I imagined it, only better. I thought we could hang it somewhere until the real thing is built," Phoebe explained. As a reminder of what we're working toward, Dawson looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "I already have everything that matters," he said, his arm around Emma as she leaned against him, examining the drawing. "This house, that's just a bonus." That evening, after Emma had finally succumbed to the excitement of the day and fallen asleep with her new doll clutched tightly, Phoebe and Dawson sat together on the sofa, his arm around her as they watched the fire. "I've been thinking," Dawson said after a comfortable silence, "about the spring when we start building the new house." Phoebe leaned her head against his shoulder, content. "I'm wondering if we should plan for another bedroom, besides ours and Emma's, I mean." Phoebe looked up at him, questioning. "For guests?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Eventually, maybe, but I was thinking more along the lines of a nursery." The implication took a moment to register. When it did, Phoebe sat up straighter, her eyes searching his. "A nursery? You mean if you want to," he said quickly. "If it's not too soon to think about. But after last night, well, it occurred to me that we might need the space sooner rather than later." The possibility hadn't even crossed Phoebe's mind, but now that Dawson had voiced it, she found herself warming to the idea with surprising speed. Another child, a baby born of their love, a sibling for Emma. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be wonderful. Emma has always wanted a brother or sister." Dawson's face lit up. "Really, you'd want that, with me?" "Of course with you," Phoebe laughed, touching his cheek. "Who else would I want to father my children?" He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that still surprised her, still made her feel as if she were melting from the inside out. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent in the darkness. Inside the cabin, warm and bright with firelight, the family that had been formed through chance and necessity, but forged by love, made plans for a future none of them could have imagined just months before. Spring arrived with a rush of green that transformed the ranch from its winter starkness. The creek swelled with snowmelt, wildflowers carpeted the rolling grasslands, and construction began on the new house beside the cottonwood trees. Phoebe, now undeniably expecting their first child together, supervised much of the work while Dawson tended to the growing herd and the daily ranch operations. Emma, nearly 5 now and bursting with excitement about becoming a big sister, spent her days alternating between helping with the construction and practicing her riding skills on Penny, who had proven to be the perfect mount for a beginner. "Pa says the baby will come when the house is finished," she informed Tom Wilkins one afternoon as he helped raise the frame for the second story. "He promised." Tom laughed, glancing at Phoebe's still modest bump. "Well, your pa's usually a man of his word, but babies tend to keep their own schedule." Phoebe smiled, resting a hand on her abdomen where the new life was just beginning to make itself known with occasional flutters of movement. "The house will be ready in plenty of time," she assured Emma. "We've still got months to wait for the baby." In truth, the timing was working out perfectly. Dawson had hired additional hands to speed the construction, determined that they would be settled in the new house well before Phoebe's confinement began. The structure was taking shape rapidly, its 2 stories already clearly defined, the downstairs rooms partially enclosed. "It's going to be beautiful," Martha Wilkins commented as she and Phoebe reviewed the plans for the kitchen. "Biggest house in the county, I'd reckon. You'll be hosting every social from Christmas to 4th of July." Phoebe laughed. "I'm not sure about that, but it will be wonderful to have the space, especially with the family growing." Martha's expression softened. "You've come a long way from that courthouse, haven't you?" "God works in mysterious ways sometimes." "He certainly does," Phoebe agreed, thinking of all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment, even the painful ones that had seemed like disasters at the time. Life had settled into a pattern that felt both secure and joyful. The marriage that had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible situation had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. Emma had flourished under Dawson's gentle guidance, developing a confidence and happiness that warmed Phoebe's heart. And now, with another child on the way, their family felt complete in a way Phoebe had never dared to dream possible. The only shadow on their happiness had been a letter that arrived in late winter, forwarded by Sheriff Taylor. It was from Thomas Blackwell, Emma's biological father, who had somehow learned of Phoebe's whereabouts and wrote expressing a sudden interest in his child. The letter had thrown Phoebe into a panic until Dawson, after reading it, had torn it into pieces and thrown it into the fire. "He has no claim on Emma," he had said firmly. "Not legally, not morally. I adopted her properly when we married. The papers are filed with the county. She's my daughter now, and he can go to hell." The fierceness of his protection had reassured Phoebe, and when no further letters came, she gradually relaxed. Blackwell had likely been motivated by a momentary curiosity or guilt, not any genuine desire to know his daughter. He had made his choice years ago, and they had made theirs. By midsummer, the house was nearly complete, a handsome 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, large windows to catch the breeze, and even an indoor pump in the kitchen as Dawson had promised. The bedrooms upstairs were spacious and bright, with Emma's room featuring a window seat where she could read and watch for approaching visitors. The nursery, adjoining Phoebe and Dawson's bedroom, was painted a soft yellow and furnished with a cradle that Dawson had crafted himself during the evenings, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. A rocking chair sat by the window, and a chest waited to be filled with the tiny garments Phoebe was steadily creating. In August, with Phoebe's time growing nearer and the summer heat at its peak, they finally moved into the completed house. The old cabin would serve as additional quarters for ranch hands, but Phoebe couldn't help feeling nostalgic as they transferred the last of their belongings to the new building. "Hard to believe everything that happened here," she said, standing in the main room that had witnessed so many changes in their lives. "It seems so small now." "But it served us well," Dawson replied, his arm around her expanded waistline. "First home we shared." "First place we kissed," Phoebe added with a smile. "First place we mama, pa," Emma's voice called from outside. "Scout found something in the barn." Exchanging amused glances at the interruption, they followed their daughter's voice to discover that the something was a litter of kittens, just born to one of the barn cats. Emma was beside herself with excitement. "Can I keep one, please?" she begged, already enraptured by the tiny blind creatures. "When they're old enough to leave their mother," Dawson agreed, crouching beside her. "And only one, mind you. The rest will make fine mousers for the barn." The discovery of the kittens became a welcome distraction during the increasingly uncomfortable final weeks of Phoebe's pregnancy. The summer heat was oppressive, making sleep difficult despite the new house's superior ventilation. Dawson was attentive to the point of hovering, constantly checking that she was comfortable, that she had enough water, that she wasn't overtaxing herself. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him with fond exasperation one evening as he insisted on helping her up from her chair. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," he replied, kissing her forehead, "and not with my child, so you'll have to put up with my fussing." September brought cooler temperatures and the first signs that the baby's arrival was imminent. Martha Wilkins, who had experience assisting at births, began stopping by daily, checking on Phoebe's progress and bringing supplies that might be needed. "Any day now, I'd guess," she said on the morning of September 10th, after examining Phoebe. "First babies sometimes take their time, but this one seems eager to meet the world." She was right. That very night, Phoebe woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking, followed shortly by the first contractions. Dawson, instantly alert at her gasp, was on his feet and pulling on clothes before she could even explain what was happening. "I'll get Martha," he said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. "Tom can stay with Emma. Just hold on, don't have the baby until I get back." Phoebe managed a pained laugh. "I'll do my best, but I don't think the baby consults my schedule." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination. Martha arrived quickly, taking charge with calm efficiency. Dawson, after settling Emma with Tom in the old cabin, returned to pace anxiously outside the bedroom door until Martha, exasperated, ordered him inside. "If you're going to wear a hole in my new floor, you might as well make yourself useful," she told him firmly. "Your wife needs you." And so he stayed, holding Phoebe's hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. His strength became hers, his unwavering presence a tether to hold on to when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. As dawn broke on September 11th, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both his parents' eyes. Martha placed the swaddled infant in Phoebe's arms, his tiny face red and indignant at the indignity of birth. "He's perfect," Phoebe whispered, counting fingers and toes with wonder. "Look what we made, Dawson." Dawson, seated on the edge of the bed beside her, seemed unable to speak. He touched the baby's cheek with a reverent finger, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "For him, for Emma, for everything." When Emma was allowed in later that morning, her reaction to her new brother was everything they could have hoped for. Her initial shyness gave way to fascination as she studied his small features. "He looks like Pa," she declared after careful consideration. "But he has Mama's nose." "What shall we call him?" Dawson asked her, having agreed that Emma should have a say in naming her brother. "Remember the names we discussed?" Emma nodded seriously. "I think he looks like a Samuel." "Like in the Bible story you read me." Phoebe and Dawson exchanged smiles. Samuel had been among their own preferences as well. "Samuel it is," Dawson agreed. "Samuel James Forrester." "That's a good name for a cowboy," Emma approved. "Or maybe a judge or a doctor." "He can be whatever he wants to be," Phoebe said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "Just like you can." As Emma chattered about all the things she would teach her brother when he was big enough, Phoebe met Dawson's gaze over their children's heads. The love she saw there matched what she felt in her own heart: boundless, unshakable, complete. Life would bring challenges, certainly. There would be difficult seasons, hard decisions, perhaps even threats like the one Thomas Blackwell had briefly posed. But they would face them together, as a family built not by chance or circumstance, but by choice and commitment and love. Outside the window of their new home, the ranch stretched green and promising under the September sky. Inside, in a room filled with morning light, Phoebe Miller Forrester held her son against her heart, her daughter's small hand in hers, her husband's steadfast presence beside them all. The journey from those courthouse steps to this moment had been unexpected, even improbable. A desperate plea, a stranger's intervention, a marriage of convenience that had transformed into the truest of bonds. The judge had ordered her child taken away, and the cowboy had said, "Not if I'm the father now." And in saying those words, in standing between Emma and those who would separate her from her mother, Dawson Forrester had set in motion a chain of events that led here to family, to home, to a love that would sustain them through all the years to come. As Samuel drifted to sleep in her arms, Phoebe offered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for brave decisions, and for the man who had become everything she never knew she needed: father to her children, partner in her life, keeper of her heart. "What are you thinking about?" Dawson asked softly, noticing her introspection. Phoebe smiled, looking from her newborn son to her daughter to the man who had saved them both in more ways than one. "I'm thinking," she said, "that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the most unlikely places." Dawson's hand found hers, squeezing gently in understanding. "Like courthouse steps," he murmured. "Like courthouse steps," she agreed, and knew with absolute certainty that their story, improbable, unexpected, perfect in its own way, was only just beginning.